Yeah. I'm told I can see my slides down there. That assumes better vision than I have. But in any event, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your kind words, Joe. I'd like to thank the Heartland Institute for providing a forum for presenting significant opposing viewpoints to the current climate hysteria. However, in saying that, I do have the feeling, and I think Joe shares this, that the conference is premised on an assumption that there are large numbers of scientists active in climate research whose work is being suppressed. There's a measure of truth in this assumption, but I think it is important to realize that the alarm concerning global warming has the implicit or explicit support of a vast majority of the active climate research community. And I think unless one recognizes that, one doesn't fully appreciate what one is dealing with. To a certain extent, this is indicative of the extent to which climate science has been corrupted over a period of more than 20 years. What this means, however, is that anyone active in the science who disagrees with the alarm must, in practice, deal with scientists on the other side in order to be professionally viable. There is no comparable coterie on our side. Now, recall I'm emphasizing climate research scientists, and what I mean by that are academic or government lab research scientists. There are groups where the opposition is much stronger. Weather forecasters, state climatologists until they started getting purged. But I'm restricting myself to the research community. And I think it pays to understand how this situation functions. Let me just bring the first slide up. Okay. There are three modes that I think can readily be identified. The first one I call triage. And this is, to me, the most interesting. The scientist at issue isolates those areas of research that are of personal importance. And within these areas, he or she preserves a reasonable degree of integrity. Outside this protected area, the scientist offers a measure of support to the reigning paradigm, and the support can range from perfunctory assent to enthusiastic campaigning. Frequently, such scientists, when their protected research lends itself to alarming interpretation, allow others to cite and exaggerate such interpretations while enjoying the rewards associated with the exaggeration and simultaneously maintaining distance from the interpretation. Now, the second mode is what I have called opportunism of the weak. Here, scientists whose work would normally be regarded as weak and unimpressive gain note by molding their results to the needs of the alarmists, especially in the environmental movement. This normally might be of little consequence to more productive scientists. However, with the support of the environmental movement, such weak opportunists can gain unwarranted authority. The examples are very well known and include the infamous hockey stick, as well as the iconic statements of the ICCC. The third mode is what I refer to as free riding. Here, the emphasis is on what are euphemistically called impacts. The specialties of the scientists involved lie well outside of climate physics, but they can find funding and recognition by attempting to relate their specialty to global warming. You all know the results are to be found in the newspapers every day. Cockroaches and malaria spreading, sex drive of butterflies diminishing, polar bears in potential danger, etc. From the point of view of serious science, this group is mostly a nuisance, but they play a major role in the maintenance of alarm. They also artificially swell the number of climate scientists, and in particular of scientists who endorse the alarmist views, which are essential to their own support. Now, that's the situation as I see it. In referring to climate alarm and hysteria, there is, however, the important question of who is and isn't alarmed and why. It is often noted, and polls support this, that ordinary people, while they don't want to be accused of denialism, as those who would question this are, but they rarely give the issue high priority. There's a certain amount of common sense. The situation with so-called elites is apparently different. Now, David Brooks, a New York Times columnist, nominally a House Republican, but some people would question that, in an article discussing Republican Party reformers, he's discussing the arguments between reformers and conservatives within the Republican Party, claims that the reformers, they tend to take global warming seriously, not only on its merits, but in the belief that conservatives cannot continue to insult the sensibilities of the educated classes and the entire East and West coasts. It's a remarkable statement, and for all I know, it is true. Now, why global warming has appealed to this group is an interesting question. However, from eugenics to Malthusian population and resource concerns, through a variety of other such movements to global warming, this group has been at the fore. The approach is generally authoritarian, with an emphasis on belief rather than understanding. There is clearly an instinct on the part of this group that is readily exploited by the environmental movement, a movement that has effectively co-opted the label of scientific authority. I think it is fair to say of the elite that having gone through the experience of higher education, they have an inordinate fear of appearing stupid by questioning authority. Moreover, accepting authority is far easier and much less risky than trying to understand the questions at issue. Okay, now, what are the questions at issue? And Joe has gone through this. We all have certain views of it. For instance, is the increase in atmospheric CO2 from 280 to roughly 380 parts per million volume since the Industrial Revolution began, is that an issue? Not really. I mean, there isn't a heck of a lot of argument on it. There's some. Is the fact that over this period, global mean temperature anomalies have increased somewhere around a half degree, maybe as much as 0.8. And again, there's not much of an argument about it. Of course, the increase has been irregular, and that implies a significant contribution from natural variability. Indeed, frankly, cooling, warming, change in general are natural features of the climate, and the mere existence of change tells us nothing beyond this. The serious questions involve quantitative issues. Is the warming sufficiently large to exclude natural origin? Is the sensitivity of climate such that we might reasonably expect such large warming in the future as a result of human activities? Is the net impact of such warming likely to be beneficial or detrimental? Are the proposed policies of relevance to climate per se? The public discussion of global warming, or the peculiarly relabeled climate change issue, has generally conflated the non-serious and serious issues, so that essentially believing that there has been warming is tantamount to believing the world has come to an end, without specifically considering the connection. This kind of conflation of non-serious and serious issues is characteristic, for instance, of Gore's PowerPoint presentation. And, you know, it is intentional and misleading sort of confusion. Now, I'll come to this in a moment. The existence of change per se is no cause for alarm or even surprise. Neither is the fact that some part of such change must certainly be due to man's activities. I mean, you know, these constant statements, do you believe there has been any warming? Do you believe man has any role? These are meaningless questions except in the propaganda scene. In science, the question is always how much. The answer is rarely nothing. Okay. Normally, I don't think this would need any discussion except for the iconic claim of the IPCC fourth assessment, namely that most of the change in temperature over the period since 1954 was due to man. Now, you have to understand this statement because it's constantly trotted out. I mean, even if this statement were true, it would not provide any support for alarm. It's saying a couple of tenths of a degree might have been due to man, and so what? Nevertheless, it's trotted out again with this conflation of the trivial with the serious. Now, there are two things I'd like to address on this. We'll come back to the alarm, but the argument itself on behalf of the IPCC statement is so bizarre that if you look at it, you will realize that something has gone amiss with the science. Here's what they did. Essentially, they took a large number of models. These are models that did not simulate known patterns of natural behavior, such as ENSO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, then claim that such models nonetheless accurately depicted natural climate variability, and use the fact that these models could not replicate the warming episode from the mid-70s through the mid-90s to argue that forcing was necessary and that the forcing must have been due to man. Think on this argument a little. If you think it's compelling, go back and think about it some more. The argument makes arguments in support of intelligent design sound rigorous by comparison. It constitutes a rejection of scientific logic while widely put forward as being demanded by science. This is a sad point for science. Equally ironic, and I think, the fact that the global mean temperature anomaly ceased increasing by the mid-90s is acknowledged by the same modeling groups as contradicting the main claim of the so-called attribution argument. And I give some references here. So here you have the modelers saying their argument is wrong. You have everyone in the media saying, if you don't believe the IPCC, you don't believe in science. The behavior of the temperature anomalies can be seen in any of the records that are used by the IPCC. Here is the famous temperature record for the anomalies from the UK Met Office. I don't know if I went to the end on this. I probably didn't have time to put in 2008. But this is an expansion from 94 to 2007. 2008 goes down a little bit more. But this is allegedly what people refer to as accelerating climate change. I mean, what does that mean? The failure of the models to predict the cessation, except for a bump associated with El Nino in '98, does not disprove the possibility of significant anthropogenic warming. But what it does disprove is the claim that the data provides evidence that recent warming is due to man. It must be emphasized that the popular projections of catastrophe hardly follow simply from warming at any level. They all depend on many additional and unpredictable factors, and it's therefore implausible on any grounds. Okay, this brings us to the last thing I want to talk about, the fundamental question of climate sensitivity. Here again, the IPCC relies on existing poorly performing models to argue that sensitivity to a doubling of CO2 could be anything from 1.5 to 5 degrees centigrade. Occasionally, they let the cat out of the bag, that it's consistent with any sensitivity from 1.5 to infinity. The claim is based on the range of results from different models. Now, this is not normal science. In normal science, you don't ask, what is the range of models? You ask, what is produced by the observations? You test models. You don't just shuffle them. Now, it turns out that such tests are eminently possible. In the usual picture of greenhouse, and I'm going to go through a little bit of mathematics here, it's all algebra, that this is a picture common in some of the electrical engineering literature. Let's say you double CO2. That provides a change in radiative forcing. We call that delta Q. The climate system without feedbacks has a certain response function given by G0, and the result is you eventually produce a change in temperature, delta T0. However, the climate system is one that may have feedbacks. What that means is the very change in temperature forces other things like clouds and water vapor to change and produces an additional flux, F delta T, proportional to the temperature change, that has to be added to G0 in order to get the final temperature response. So that's that loop at the bottom. Now, here is a review of the situation. So you now have the real delta T is not only G0 times delta Q, but this new change in flux proportional to temperature caused by the feedbacks. And you can solve for delta T, and you get the expression in the middle there, delta T0 over 1 minus little f, where little f is the feedback factor. If little f is between 0 and 1, you have positive feedback. If it's greater than 1, you have a blow-up. If you have a negative f, you have a negative feedback. The feedback is essentially the change in flux for a change in temperature. So it's a measurable thing. There are some constraints on it. The negative sign refers to positive feedback, positive to negative feedback. It's an example of the numbers, but don't worry about those. Now, the idea here is the following, and one has the data. One takes fluxes observed by satellite. One has 16 years of reasonably stable corrected output from the IRBI, Earth Radiation Budget Experiment, satellite. And you also have the IPCC models. And these are forced by the observed temperature in one set of tests and produce the radiative budget, both the reflected light and the outgoing long-wave radiation. So you have the model output for what you're measuring with the satellite to compare the two. And finally, for sea surface temperature, at least, and surface temperature in general, you have the National Center for Environmental Prediction has the data for this, not as fine as one might like, but one has it. Okay, so at the top here, and at the very top left, you have the sea surface temperature, and the horizontal coordinate is year, running from, I think, 1986 to 90-something, 98, 99. And you have periods of rise, decrease, rise, and so on, segments. What you do is take these segments, and then the next curve down marked IRBI is the satellite infrared. The black curves, don't worry if you can't see them particularly, are the results from the various models, 11 models used by the IPCC. These are the same curves for the visible light instead of the infrared, and that's reflected light as calculated and as observed. And all you do is for each of them, for each segment of temperature increase, decrease, form the ratio of delta F, delta T. And what you get are these curves for the models. And so a slope downwards is a negative slope, and as we saw, that corresponds to positive feedback. And what we see is that every model, although they vary a little, every single model produces positive feedback. And that fact has led virtually all scientific bodies, including the IPCC, to declare this property must be robust. But what does the data show? Well, it shows that thing. It shows exactly the opposite. It shows a very small R, a very large R squared, rather small scatter. It's an unambiguous result. And it's saying all the models are wrong. The feedback can be estimated, and it shows you a very interesting fact. Go back to this little equation and just plot it. Okay, what you have here, and I wish I had a pointer or something, but you have that curve, and that is a curve that will relate the feedback factor on the right or the change in flux on the left to the equilibrium climate sensitivity. You have a horizontal line at the top that corresponds to the Earth Radiation Budget Experiment satellite, and the spread, the gray area above and below, is the uncertainty in that flux. At the bottom, you have the model results and the scatter. Okay, and you have the, yeah, there it is. And you have the scatter of the determination of these results. And that gives you the gray limit here. Now, if I look at where this curve intercepts this point, and then where it intercepts this point, I see that the output is not good enough to determine the climate sensitivity between about 1.5 degrees and infinity. And that's because we're in the, if I can do it, we're in the flat part of this curve where it's asymptoting. On the other hand, if you take IRBI data if I can find this, it's in this part of the curve where the spread is very little. It identifies you at about a ½ degree per a doubling of CO2. And so that's well determined. We understand why the models since 1979 never reduced the uncertainty. Now, normally, this would be it. I mean, it's saying the very foundation of the issue of global warming is wrong. The models on which it's predicated are wrong. In a normal field, these results would pretty much wrap things up. But global warming, climate change, has developed so much momentum that it has a life of its own, quite removed from science. One can reasonably expect that what I refer to as the opportunism of the weak will lead to efforts to alter the data, though the results presented here have survived several alterations of the data already. See, sometimes they don't know what to alter. Perhaps most important, these results will of necessity, to quote David Brooks, offend the sensibilities of the educated classes and the entire East and West coasts. And who would want to do that? Thank you.
That's terrific. Let's stay here for a moment. Like some water?
Yeah.